Thanksgiving at my grandmother's estate had always been predictable, like a movie I'd seen too many times. The dining room gleamed with inherited silver, crystal glasses catching light from the chandelier, and napkins folded into perfect swans. Everything smelled amazing: turkey, cinnamon, freshly baked rolls, but beneath that perfect scene lay an unspoken truth everyone ignored. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My brother Mason sat in his usual spot, relaxed and confident like he owned the place. And in a way, he did. Not legally, but in all the ways that mattered in our family. Mason didn't have to try. He never had. The world, our world, revolved around him. My mother, Elaine, orchestrated this dynamic with practiced precision. Her voice lifted whenever she mentioned Mason's name. Her stories always circled back to his latest achievement. Got that promotion. Invested in a new business. Traveled to some exclusive destination. The way she talked about him, you'd think he'd single-handedly solved climate change. And me? I was Olivia, the afterthought, the one who helped in the kitchen. The one whose questions were met with vague interest before conversation drifted back to Mason. My accomplishments were footnotes, if mentioned at all. The ritual started the same way every year. Once everyone was seated and the preliminary small talk exhausted, Elaine would straighten her posture, a signal that her annual performance was about to begin. So, she said, lifting her wine glass with theatrical precision. Mason just finalized that partnership deal with that tech company from Seattle. Her voice practically sang with pride. They're projecting 8-figure revenue in the first year alone. A real power move. The table hummed with expected praise. Uncle Richard nodded appreciatively. My cousin Zoe gasped in manufactured amazement. Mason barely acknowledged the attention, just gave that humble half-smile that said, "Please, stop." But actually, keep going. I took a sip of water and tried to disappear into my chair. Then, right on schedule, Elaine turned toward me, her expression shifting to something more pointed. "Olivia, honey," she said, that sugary concern barely masking her disappointment. "Have you thought any more about that management position I mentioned? The one at Richard's firm? It didn't matter that I declined that offer months ago. It didn't matter that I'd explained my reasons. In Elaine's script, I was still the daughter who needed saving from her own choices. For years, I played my part." I nodded politely, gave non-committal answers. "I'll think about it, or maybe after the new year." I smiled through gritted teeth because causing a scene would only confirm what they already believed, that I was emotional, impulsive. Not like steady, strategic Mason. But this year was different. Not because I had a flashy announcement or because I'd finally caved to their expectations. This year was different because I no longer felt the need to convince them of my worth. The realization hadn't come with thunder or lightning. It was quiet, like waking up one morning and noticing that a chronic pain you'd grown accustomed to had finally disappeared. I'd stopped measuring myself against their yardstick without even noticing when the change happened. My grandmother Elizabeth, the only one who ever saw me clearly, had passed away 3 months earlier. Her last words to me were simple: "Live your truth loudly, Olivia." I waited too long to live mine. Now, as Elaine waited for my response about the job, I looked up and met her gaze steadily. I let the silence stretch between us, uncomfortable and heavy. Everyone at the table shifted slightly, sensing the deviation from the script. Mason glanced up from his plate, curious about the extended pause. Elaine's smile tightened. "Well?" she prompted, clearly expecting my usual acquiescence. I set my fork down carefully. "I've built something of my own," I said evenly. The table fell quiet. My words weren't dramatic, but they weren't in the script, and that was enough to draw everyone's attention. "What do you mean?" Elaine asked, her tone cautious as if approaching something potentially dangerous. "I mean, I've spent the last 3 years building something that matters to me," I replied. "Something that's mine." Mason leaned forward slightly. "Like a hobby?" he asked, his tone suggesting benevolent interest while simultaneously diminishing whatever I might say next. I smiled, not the apologetic smile they were used to, but something calmer, more certain. "No, not a hobby. A company." Elaine laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Oh, that little online thing you were doing? The crafts?" "It's not crafts," I said, my voice still even. "It's a tech platform that connects artisans in rural communities with global markets. We've eliminated predatory middlemen and increased maker profits by an average of 62%. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Uncle Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. My cousin Zoe stopped mid-bite. Mason's expression remained neutral, but I noticed his shoulders stiffen. Well, that sounds interesting, Elaine said, clearly searching for a way to acknowledge my words without giving them real weight. It's nice to have a passion project. It's not a passion project, I corrected her gently. It's a business that generated $4 million in revenue last quarter. The silence that followed was different from any silence I'd experienced in this house before. It wasn't the awkward pause after someone said something inappropriate. It wasn't the respectful hush when Grandpa used to say grace. This was the silence of a narrative collapsing, of a story they'd all agreed upon suddenly revealing itself to be fiction. Elaine recovered first. $4 million, she repeated, her voice rising slightly. That can't be right. It is, I said simply. Mason set his glass down with more force than necessary. Why haven't you mentioned any of this before? There was an edge to his question, something between accusation and disbelief. I turned to him with genuine curiosity. When would I have mentioned it? Between your promotion story and your investment story? Or maybe during the annual "Why Olivia Should Work for Uncle Richard" discussion? My words landed like small stones dropping into still water, not violent, but creating ripples nonetheless. Uncle Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably. Zoe suddenly became very interested in rearranging her peas. That's not fair, Elaine said, her voice hardening. We always ask about your life. You ask if I'm dating anyone, I corrected her. You ask if I've considered real estate. You ask if I'm still doing that online thing. You don't ask about my business plans or my 5-year growth strategy or the investors I've turned down. Mason's face had taken on an expression I'd rarely seen, uncertainty. He'd always been the one with the answers, the path, the plan. That everyone admired. Now he was recalculating, trying to place me in this new context. $4 million is impressive, he said finally, his tone suggesting he was granting approval. You should have come to me for advice. I could have helped you structure things properly. I felt a familiar flicker of annoyance, but it didn't burn as hot as it once might have. I didn't need advice, I said. I needed the freedom to fail on my own terms. And it turns out, I didn't fail. Elaine frowned, her fingers tightening around her wine stem. You always make everything so difficult, Olivia. If you'd just told us, I did tell you, I interrupted, still calm. 3 Thanksgivings ago, I tried to explain my business model. Mason changed the subject to his new car, and you spent 20 minutes asking him about the horsepower. Mason had the grace to look slightly embarrassed, but Elaine wasn't ready to concede. Well, you never make these things sound important, she insisted. You're always so quiet about your achievements. How are we supposed to know? I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something I hadn't noticed before. Fear. Not of me, exactly, but of what I represented, a challenge to the family mythology she'd carefully constructed over decades. You're right, I said, surprising everyone at the table, including myself. I should have been louder. I should have demanded attention instead of waiting for it to be offered. That's on me. Elaine blinked, thrown off balance by my agreement. She reached for her wine, clearly trying to process this unexpected turn. So this business, Uncle Richard said, breaking the tension. What's your overhead like? How are you handling distribution? Before I could answer, Elaine cut in. Richard, please. This is hardly dinner conversation. I raised an eyebrow. But Mason's partnership negotiations were? That's different, she said automatically. How? I asked, genuinely curious about what answer she might give. Because, she began, then stopped. For perhaps the first time in my adult life, I watched my mother struggle for words. Because Mason's business matters are more established than $4 million in quarterly revenue. Uncle Richard asked, his tone carefully neutral but his meaning clear. Mason cleared his throat. Let's all just calm down. Olivia's obviously done well for herself, and that's great. Really great. But let's not make this into some kind of competition. I almost laughed. Everything had always been a competition in our family, one with rules designed to ensure Mason always won. The fact that he wanted to suspend the game now that he might not be the clear victor was so predictable it almost took the sting out of years of comparison. You're right, I agreed. It's not a competition. It never should have been. Elaine seemed to sense an opportunity to regain control of the conversation. Exactly, she said with visible relief. Family isn't about comparing achievements. It's about supporting each other. Is it? I asked quietly. The question hung in the air, simple but devastating. No one seemed eager to claim that had been our family's operating principle, given the evening's revelations. Mason shifted in his seat. Look, we're all proud of you, Olivia. If we haven't shown it properly, that's on us. But Mom's right, you've always been so private about your work. I nodded slowly. I was private because privacy was safer than being dismissed. After a while, you stop sharing things that matter to you with people who don't treat them with care. Elaine's face flushed. That's not fair. We've always supported you, you've always tolerated me, I corrected her gently. There's a difference. This is ridiculous, Elaine said, her voice rising slightly. You're making it sound like we've mistreated you somehow. We've given you every opportunity. No, I said. You've given Mason every opportunity. You've given me every suggestion. Mason leaned forward. Come on, Olivia. You know that's not true. Mom has always bent over backward for both of us. I turned to him. When I wanted to study computer science, she tried to talk me into communications because it would be less stressful. When you wanted to drop out of business school to start your first company, she liquidated her retirement account to fund you. Mason's expression hardened. That was different. I had a solid business plan, so did I said. But no one asked to see it. You never said you needed money, Elaine protested. I didn't, I agreed. Because I knew better than to ask. The tension around the table was palpable now. Uncle Richard studied his plate with intense focus. Cousin Zoe looked like she was witnessing a car accident in slow motion, horrified but unable to look away. I think we should change the subject, Elaine said firmly. This isn't productive. Actually, I said, setting my napkin beside my plate, I think it's the most productive conversation we've had in years. Mason's jaw tightened. What exactly are you trying to accomplish here, Olivia? Ruin Thanksgiving? I met his gaze steadily. I'm not trying to ruin anything. I'm just no longer interested in pretending. Pretending what? He challenged. Pretending that the way this family operates is normal or healthy. Pretending that I'm okay being an afterthought. Pretending that your success matters more than mine because it fits better with Mom's narrative. Elaine stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. That's enough, she said, her voice shaking slightly. I won't sit here and be accused of playing favorites. I have always loved you both equally. Love isn't the issue, I said quietly. The issue is respect. Respect is earned, she shot back. I nodded slowly. Yes, it is. And I've earned it. Just not here. Mason scoffed. So what, one good business quarter and suddenly you're too good for your family? No, I said. 29 years of being treated like I'm less than, and I'm finally good enough for myself. The words landed with more weight than I'd intended. Mason fell silent, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something like regret flash across his face before his expression hardened again. Your brother has worked incredibly hard to get where he is, Elaine said, still standing. You have no idea the pressure he's been under, the sacrifices he's made. You're right, I agreed. I don't know, because his journey has been narrated in detail at every family gathering for the past decade. But you know nothing about mine, because you never bothered to ask. That's not fair, Elaine repeated, but her protest sounded hollow even to my ears. Isn't it? I asked. When was the last time you asked me about my work? Not whether I was still doing that online thing, but actual questions about my business strategy, my challenges, my successes? She opened her mouth, then closed it. Again. The silence was answer enough. For what it's worth, Uncle Richard said suddenly, I'd be interested in hearing more about your company, Olivia. $4 million in quarterly revenue is impressive by any standard. Elaine shot him a betrayed look, but he met it evenly. It is impressive, he insisted. And if we're talking about Mason's ventures at every family dinner, I don't see why we can't talk about Olivia's. Because she's obviously just trying to cause a scene, Mason said dismissively. This isn't about her business. This is about her feeling sorry for herself. I looked at my brother, really looked at him, and felt a wave of something unexpected, pity. For the first time, I saw the weight of all that expectation, all that adoration. How exhausting it must be to always be the golden child, to know that any failure would be devastating not just to him but to our mother's entire worldview. I don't feel sorry for myself, Mason, I said gently. Not anymore. I actually feel pretty good about where I am and what I've built. I just don't understand why that's so threatening to both of you. Threatening? Elaine repeated incredulously. That's absurd. Is it? I asked. Because from where I'm sitting, my success seems to make you both deeply uncomfortable. And I'm trying to understand why. Mason pushed his plate away. This is ridiculous. I'm not threatened by your little startup. Good for you, making some money. No one's saying that isn't great. We just don't need the dramatics and the accusations. Your brother's right, Elaine said, finally sitting back down. If you've done well for yourself, we're happy for you. But this attitude, this need to turn it into some kind of family therapy session, it's exactly the kind of emotional decision-making that's always held you back. And there it was. The familiar dismissal. The subtle undermining, the implication that any emotion I expressed was evidence of my inferiority. In the past, this would have silenced me, made me question myself. But not today. What's held me back, I said quietly, wasn't my emotions. It was spending so much energy trying to be seen by people who weren't looking. The table fell silent. Again. Uncle Richard nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly. Cousin Zoe stared at me with something like admiration. Mason pushed his chair back. I'm getting some air, he muttered, standing up and walking toward the patio doors without waiting for a response. Elaine watched him go, then turned back to me, her expression hardening. Are you satisfied now? She asked. You've upset your brother. I met her gaze steadily. I think he's upset because something he's always taken for granted, his position in this family, suddenly feels less secure. And that's not my fault. This family has always supported both of you, she insisted. If you felt otherwise, that's your interpretation. You're right, I agreed. It is my interpretation. Based on 29 years of evidence. And what evidence is that? She challenged. I took a deep breath. When Mason graduated college, you threw him a party and gave him Grandpa's watch. When I graduated, with honors, you asked if I was sure I didn't want to get a teaching certificate as a backup. Uncle Richard winced slightly. Elaine's lips pressed into a thin line. When Mason's first business failed, I continued, you told everyone it was because the market wasn't ready for his vision. When my first attempt didn't immediately succeed, you suggested I might not be cut out for the business world. I was trying to protect you, Elaine said, her voice tight. The business world can be brutal, especially for women. I didn't need protection, I said. I needed the same unwavering belief you've always given Mason. That's not, she began, then stopped. For a moment, just a moment, I saw uncertainty cross her face. Uncle Richard cleared his throat. Elaine, he said gently, she might have a point. My mother turned to him, betrayal written across her features. Richard, you can't possibly. I remember when Olivia came to me 3 years ago with her business plan, he interrupted. It was solid. Innovative, even. I offered to introduce her to some investors, but she declined. Said she wanted to build it her way. Elaine blinked, clearly surprised by this revelation. You never told me that. She asked me not to, he said simply. And after watching this conversation, I think I understand why. Elaine turned back to me, confusion replacing some of the anger in her expression. You went to Richard for advice. But not to me? Not to your family? I went to someone who I thought would take me seriously, I said quietly. Someone who wouldn't immediately try to talk me out of it or compare it to Mason's ventures. The patio door slid open, and Mason stepped back into the dining room. His face was composed again, but there was something different in his posture, less certainty, perhaps, or just less entitlement. He took his seat without a word, picked up his fork, and pushed food around his plate for a moment before speaking. So, $4 million in revenue, he said finally. What's your profit margin? The question wasn't hostile. For perhaps the first time in our adult lives, he was asking me a real business question, one professional to another. 38%, I answered. We reinvest most of it in expanding our artisan network and improving the platform. He nodded slowly. That's impressive. Sustainable. Thank you, I said, meaning it. A strange silence fell over the table, not tense like before, but uncertain, as if none of us quite knew how to navigate this new territory where I was not just Mason's little sister but a successful entrepreneur in my own right. Elaine cleared her throat. Well, she said, her tone deliberately light. I suppose we should be proud to have 2 successful children. The words should have been validating, but something in her tone, the suggestion that my success was unexpected, a pleasant surprise rather than something she'd always believed possible, kept them from landing as she likely intended. You should be, Uncle Richard agreed, either missing or ignoring the subtext. Not many families can boast 2 entrepreneurs doing so well. Mason took a sip of his wine, studying me over the rim of his glass. Why didn't you ever say anything, he asked, and for once, there was no condescension in his tone. Just genuine curiosity. I considered the question carefully. Because I needed to do it for myself, I said finally. Not to prove anything to anyone else. Just to know that I could. He nodded slowly, as if this made sense to him. Perhaps it did. For all our differences, we shared the same drive, the same determination. The difference was that his had always been celebrated, while mine had been questioned. Well, Elaine said, reaching for the serving spoon, who would like more stuffing? And just like that, she was trying to return us to the script, to the familiar comfort of holiday routine where difficult truths could be buried beneath small talk and second helpings. I set my napkin on the table and stood. Actually, I said, I think I'm going to head out. Elaine looked up, alarmed. You're leaving? But we haven't even had dessert. I know, I said. But I think I've said what I needed to say, and I'd prefer to end the evening here. Olivia, don't be dramatic, she began, but Uncle Richard cut her off. Let her go, Elaine, he said quietly. Sometimes space is the best thing. Mason looked up at me, his expression unreadable. Will you be at Christmas? He asked, and there was something in his voice I couldn't quite identify, concern, perhaps, or the first hint of understanding what it might be like if I simply removed myself from the family equation. I don't know, I answered honestly. I'll have to think about it. Elaine stood, distress evident in her movements. Olivia, please. Let's not end the evening like this. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just my mother, with all her flaws and favoritism, but a woman who had constructed her entire identity around her children, particularly her son. A woman who genuinely might not have realized the damage her behavior had caused because it was so deeply ingrained in how she understood the world. I'm not trying to punish you, I said gently. I just need some distance to figure out what kind of relationship we can have moving forward, one based on who I actually am, not who you've always assumed I was. I know who you are, she insisted, but the uncertainty in her eyes suggested otherwise. I smiled sadly. I don't think you do. But I'd like the chance to show you someday, if you're willing to see. Without waiting for a response, I gathered my coat and purse. Uncle Richard stood and gave me a brief, supportive hug. Cousin Zoe whispered, "Call me tomorrow," as I passed her chair. Mason remained seated, but as I reached the doorway, he called out, "Olivia?" I turned back. "Your company," he said. "What's it called?" It was such a simple question, but the fact that he was asking it now, after 3 years, spoke volumes. Artisan Global, I replied. You can look it up. He nodded, a small, almost respectful gesture. I will. As I walked to my car in the crisp November air, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just free. Free from the need for their approval, free from the shadow of comparison, free to be exactly who I was without apology or explanation. I hadn't come to Thanksgiving looking for a confrontation. I hadn't planned to disrupt the careful hierarchy my mother had established over decades. But sometimes truth finds its own moment to emerge, and when it does, the only choice is whether to speak it or continue living in the comfort of familiar lies. I had chosen truth, and while the future of my family relationships remained uncertain, I knew one thing with absolute clarity: I would never again make myself smaller to fit someone else's expectations. And that certainty felt like coming home to myself in a way that no family dinner ever had. The drive back to my apartment was quiet. No music, no podcasts, just the steady hum of the engine and the occasional tap of raindrops on the windshield. My mind replayed the evening, the looks on their faces, the way Mason's confidence had faltered, the confusion in my mother's eyes when her carefully constructed narrative began to unravel. 3 years ago, that confrontation would have left me shaking, desperate for their approval, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. Tonight, I felt only clarity. Grandmother Elizabeth would have been proud. I pulled into my building's garage, parked, and sat for a moment in the stillness. My phone lit up with a text from Uncle Richard, "Proud of you, kiddo. Call if you need anything." A small smile crossed my face. At least someone in the family saw me clearly. When I reached my apartment, I kicked off my heels and poured myself a glass of wine. My laptop sat on the coffee table, open to the quarterly reports I'd been reviewing before leaving for dinner. 4 million in revenue. Numbers. That would have impressed anyone except the people who should have been most invested in my success. I closed the laptop. Tonight wasn't about work. Tonight was about acknowledging a truth I'd been dancing around for years: I couldn't make my family see me. That was their limitation, not mine. The next morning, I woke to sunshine streaming through my blinds and 3 missed calls from Elaine. I ignored them and made coffee instead, taking it out to my small balcony overlooking the city. The air was crisp, carrying that distinct November chill that always reminded me of new beginnings. My phone buzzed again. Mason this time. A text, "Can we talk?" I set the phone down without responding. Whatever he wanted to say could wait until I was ready to hear it. The weekend passed quietly. I worked, went for a run, had dinner with friends who celebrated my latest business milestone without a hint of surprise or suspicion. By Monday morning, I'd almost convinced myself that Thanksgiving had been a necessary clean break, painful but healing. Then came the email from Elaine. Subject line, "Lunch?" I stared at it for a long time before opening it. "Olivia, I've been thinking about what you said at Thanksgiving. Perhaps we could meet for lunch this week? Just the 2 of us. Mom, no excuses, no accusations, no attempt to rewrite what had happened. Just a simple invitation." I was still contemplating my response when my assistant, Jada, knocked on my office door. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but there's someone here to see you. Says he doesn't have an appointment but that it's important." I looked up. "Who is it?" "Your brother," she replied, watching my reaction carefully. Jada had been with me since the beginning. She knew enough about my family dynamics to understand this wasn't a routine visit. I took a deep breath. "Send him in." Mason appeared in the doorway, looking strangely out of place in my domain. He wore his usual impeccable suit, but something about his posture was different, less entitled, more cautious. "Nice office," he said, glancing around at the open space with its floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist decor. "Very, you." I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or not. "Thanks," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "What brings you here, Mason?" He sat down, straightening his tie in a gesture I recognized as nervousness, something I rarely associated with my perpetually confident brother. "I looked up your company," he said without preamble. "Artisan Global." "You weren't exaggerating about the numbers." I raised an eyebrow. "Did you think I was?" He had the grace to look embarrassed. "Not exactly. I guess I didn't realize the scale of what you'd built." "Most people don't," I said simply. "That's by design. We focus on impact, not publicity." Mason nodded slowly, taking in the view from my office windows. "This building can't be cheap," he observed. "Prime downtown real estate." "We do well," I replied, unwilling to discuss specific numbers with him. Some boundaries needed to remain intact. "Is that why you're here? To verify my success?" He shifted in his seat. "No. I'm here to apologize." Of all the things I'd expected him to say, that wasn't on the list. Mason didn't apologize, not to me, not to anyone. In our family's hierarchy, he'd never needed to. "For what, specifically?" I asked, not making it easier for him. Years of diminishment couldn't be erased with a vague expression of regret. He met my gaze directly. "For not seeing you," he said simply. "For assuming that because you chose a different path than mine, it was less valid. For never asking about your work in any meaningful way." I studied him, looking for signs of insincerity or manipulation. Found none. "Thank you," I said finally. "I appreciate that." "There's more," he continued, leaning forward slightly. "After you left, Mom and I had a long conversation. Actually, more like an argument at first, but it evolved into something more honest." I raised an eyebrow. "Honest how?" "She didn't want to admit there was any truth to what you said. About the favoritism, about how she dismissed your choices. I defended her at first, out of habit, I guess." "Of course you did," I said, unable. "I did. But then Uncle Richard stepped in and said something that made me really think. He said, if you two spent half as much time listening to Olivia as you do talking about her, you might actually know her." I couldn't help but smile. Good. Old Uncle Richard, always cutting through the noise. "And that hit me," Mason continued. "He was right. We talk about you, your potential, your choices, what you should do differently, but we never really talk to you. Or listen when you try to tell us who you actually are." The admission hung between us, simple but profound. "So," he said. After a pause, "I'm here to listen. Tell me about Artisan Global. How did you build all this?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to send him away, to protect the world I'd created from the judgment that had always followed me within my family. But another part, the part that had stood up at Thanksgiving, recognized this as an opportunity to be seen on my own terms. "It started after that trip I took to Colombia," I began. "The one Mom called my quarter-life crisis adventure." Mason winced slightly. "I remember. While I was there, I met these incredible artisans, weavers, carvers, painters. Their work was museum quality, but they were getting pennies for it because they had no direct access to markets willing to pay fair prices." I stood up and walked to the window, energized as I always was when talking about the company's origins. I came back with an idea, a platform that would connect these artisans directly with consumers worldwide. No exploitative middlemen, no corporate markup. Just beautiful, handcrafted pieces and the stories of the people who made them. "And people responded to that," Mason said. "It wasn't a question." "They did. We started small, just a website and partnerships with 3 communities in Colombia. But it grew quickly. People don't just want products anymore, they want connection, meaning, impact." I turned back to face him. "Now we work with over 200 artisan communities across 37 countries. Every piece sold includes the creator's story and a breakdown of where the money goes. We've increased average artisan income by 62%. Mason nodded slowly. "That's genuinely impressive, Olivia. Why didn't you ever tell me about any of this?" I gave him a look that said the answer should be obvious. Right. He acknowledged. You tried, and we didn't listen. It's not just that, I said, returning to my desk. For years, I measured my worth against yours in this family. Every success of mine was held up against your achievements and found lacking. At some point, I stopped playing that game. I decided to build something meaningful on my own terms, without constantly seeking validation I was never going to get. He was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. I never realized how much I benefited from the way Mom treated us differently. He said finally. It was just normal to me. That's how privilege works, I replied, not unkindly. You don't see it when you have it. He looked up sharply, ready to defend himself, then seemed to think better of it. You're right, he admitted. I never had to fight to be taken seriously in this family. That was just given to me. The admission hung between us, not quite healing the rift, but acknowledging its existence, which was a start. So what happens now? He asked after a pause. I considered the question. That depends on what you want, Mason. If you're here because Mom sent you to smooth things over so we can all pretend Thanksgiving never happened, then nothing changes. We go back to our separate lives, and I continue maintaining my distance. That's not why I'm here, he said firmly. I'm here because I realized I don't know my sister. Not really. And I'd like to. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. This wasn't the Mason I was used to, confident to the point of arrogance, secure in his position as the family favorite. This was someone more vulnerable, more genuine. Then we start over, I said simply. Not as Mom's children with all that history and comparison between us. Just as two adults who happen to be siblings and might have something to learn from each other. He nodded slowly. I'd like that. But, I added, it has to be real, Mason. No competing, no undermining, no reporting back to Mom about my life so she can find new ways to question my choices. Understood, he said. Then, with a hint of his old confidence, so, any chance I could get a tour of this place? See what $4 million in quarterly revenue looks like up close? I almost smiled. Some things didn't change entirely. But the fact that he was here, asking to see my world instead of assuming it was less important than his, that was new. Sure, I said, standing up. But first, tell me something. Why did you really come here today? The truth. He considered the question, clearly weighing his words carefully. After you left on Thanksgiving, I couldn't stop thinking about something. You've built all this company, this life, completely on your own terms. No family connections, no constant approval, no safety net of being the favorite. He paused, looking slightly uncomfortable with what he was about to admit. And I realized, that might take more courage than anything I've ever done. The admission hung between us, reshaping the air. It wasn't quite an acknowledgement of all the advantages he'd enjoyed, but it was close. Thank you for saying that, I said quietly. He nodded, standing up. So, about that tour? As I showed Mason around the office, introducing him to my team. Explaining our operations, I watched his expression shift from polite interest to genuine admiration. He asked thoughtful questions, engaged with my employees respectfully, and seemed to be truly trying to understand the business I'd built. By the time we reached the conference room where we displayed products from our artisan partners, something had changed between us. Not healed, exactly, but shifted, like tectonic plates adjusting to a new reality. This is remarkable, Olivia, he said, examining a hand-woven textile from Guatemala. You've created something with real impact. That was always the goal, I replied. Money was secondary. He smiled slightly. Maybe that's why you've succeeded where others have failed. You weren't just chasing profits. Coming from Mason, who had always prioritized financial metrics above all else, this was unexpected validation. Would you like to grab lunch? He asked as we finished the tour. There's something else I wanted to talk to you about. Curiosity got the better of me. Sure. There's a good place around the corner. As we settled into a quiet booth at the restaurant, Mason seemed to be gathering his thoughts. He ordered a sparkling water instead of his usual cocktail, another small sign that this wasn't a typical performance. I've been thinking about what you said at Thanksgiving, he began after our orders were placed. About how Mom gave me opportunities that she never extended to you. I nodded but remained silent, giving him space to continue. The thing is, you were right. When my first company failed, she didn't just offer emotional support. She bailed me out. Completely. Covered. Nearly $500,000 in debt that would have bankrupted me. This was news to me. I'd known there was financial support, but not the extent of it. That's substantial, I said carefully. It was everything, he admitted. Without it, I wouldn't have been able to start over. All that success she brags about? It exists because I got a safety net you never did. The admission hung between us, heavy with implications. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. He met my gaze directly. Because you deserve to know that what you've built is entirely yours. No bailouts, no family connections opening doors, no financial safety net. Just your vision and hard work. The validation shouldn't have mattered after all this time, but something in me, some small, persistent need for acknowledgement, eased at his words. Thank you, I said simply. There's more, he continued, looking slightly uncomfortable. After you left Thanksgiving, Mom tried to dismiss everything you'd said. Claimed you were exaggerating, being dramatic. I wasn't surprised. It was her typical response to anything that challenged her worldview. But Uncle Richard called her out, Mason continued. Told her he'd seen your business plan years ago, that he'd offered to help but you declined. Said it was one of the most impressive proposals he'd ever seen, and that her dismissal of your work said more about her than about you. I made a mental note to send Uncle Richard a very expensive bottle of scotch. How did she take that? I asked, genuinely curious about Elaine's reaction to having her narrative challenged by someone other than me. Mason grimaced slightly. Not well, initially. She tried to argue that she'd always supported you, that you were the one who never shared anything. But then Aunt Carol jumped in. This was unexpected. Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, usually stayed out of family disagreements. What did she say? She reminded Mom about your college graduation. How you'd tried to tell everyone about that tech competition you'd won, but Mom kept interrupting to talk about my new job. Said she'd always noticed how your achievements were minimized while mine were celebrated. I sat back, processing this. It was one thing to know that the dynamic had been obvious to me. It was another to hear that extended family members had seen it too. By the end of the night, Mason continued, Mom was pretty quiet. I think it was the first time she'd ever been confronted with how her behavior might have affected you. And you? I asked. What did you think? He was quiet for a moment, considering. I thought about all the times I'd accepted praise for things that weren't particularly exceptional. All the times I'd watched your accomplishments get downplayed. Without saying anything. All the ways I benefited from being the favorite without ever acknowledging it. Our food arrived, creating a natural pause in the conversation. As we began eating, I realized how strange this was, having lunch with my brother, discussing family dynamics openly instead of dancing around them with polite fictions. I'm not here to apologize for Mom, Mason said after a few bites. She needs to do that herself, if she's capable of it. I'm here because I realized something important. I don't want to be the person who gets ahead because the playing field was tilted in his favor. I want to earn my place. I studied him, surprised by the evolution in his thinking. That's a significant shift for you. He nodded. Watching you stand up at Thanksgiving made me question a lot of things I've taken for granted, including my own success. Your success is real, Mason, I said, finding myself in the unexpected position of reassuring him. You've worked hard. The fact that you had advantages doesn't negate that. Maybe, he conceded. But it does mean I need to be more honest about those advantages. And more aware of how others, like you, haven't had them. We ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the tension between us easing into something more thoughtful. There's something else, he said finally. Mom wants to have dinner. Just the three of us. I set down my fork. When? Tonight? If you're available. Well, I think she's ready to listen. Really listen. I considered this. Part of me wanted to decline, to protect the clarity and peace I'd found by stepping away from the family dynamic. Another part recognized that real change might be possible, if not in Elaine's fundamental character, then at least in how we related to each other going forward. What do you think? I asked. Is she genuinely interested in hearing me, or just in smoothing things over? Mason considered the question carefully. I think she's scared. For the first time, she's facing the possibility that her actions have driven you away. That's new territory for her. Fear isn't the same as understanding, I pointed out. No, he agreed. But it might be a starting point. I took a sip of water, weighing my options. Where would this dinner be? Neutral ground, he said immediately. Not her house, not your place. I suggested Marcello's. An upscale restaurant. Downtown, public enough that everyone would behave, private enough for a real conversation. Not a bad choice. All right, I said finally. I'll be there. But I'm not pretending Thanksgiving didn't happen, and I'm not backing down from what I said. I wouldn't expect you to, Mason replied. Actually, I'd be disappointed if you did. The comment surprised me. That's new. He smiled slightly. Maybe I'm starting to appreciate my sister's backbone. As we finished lunch and prepared to go our separate ways, Mason hesitated, then asked, "So, this platform of yours, connecting artisans directly with markets. Have you considered expanding beyond handcrafts? There might be other industries where the same model could work." For the first time in our adult lives, he was asking about my business with genuine interest, not competitive comparison. "We're actually exploring that now," I replied. "Agricultural products, textiles, even digital art. The principle is the same, eliminating exploitative middlemen, ensuring creators receive fair compensation for their work." He nodded thoughtfully. "If you ever want to bounce ideas around." "Well, I'm not entirely useless in the business department." I almost smiled. It was an olive branch, awkwardly extended but sincere. "I'll keep that in mind," I said. As I watched him walk away, I realized something had fundamentally changed between us. Not healed, not yet, but shifted, from the competitive dynamic our mother had fostered to something with the potential to be more authentic, more equal. That evening, as I prepared for dinner with Elaine and Mason, I felt a strange mix of emotions: caution, hope, determination. The conversation ahead wouldn't be easy, but maybe, just maybe, it would be worth having. Marcello's was busy but not crowded, the kind of elegant hum that makes conversation feel private even in a public space. I arrived 15 minutes early, a habit from years of business meetings. The maitre d' led me to a corner table partially screened by a tasteful arrangement of plants. Perfect for what promised to be a complicated family discussion. I ordered a glass of Cabernet and used the quiet minutes to center myself. This wasn't about winning an argument or extracting an apology. It was about establishing new boundaries. New expectations for how we would interact going forward, if we interacted at all. Mason arrived next, punctual as always. He spotted me immediately and made his way over, looking more casual than he had at his office in dark jeans and a charcoal sweater. "You beat me here," he said, taking the seat across from me. "I'm always early," I replied. "You know that." He gave me a curious look. "Do I? I guess there's a lot about you I've taken for granted." It was a small acknowledgement but telling. "Mom confirmed she's coming?" I asked. He nodded. "She texted from the car. Should be here any minute." We fell into an almost comfortable silence, both aware that the real conversation couldn't start until Elaine arrived. The waiter brought Mason scotch, neat, and refreshed my wine. "Thanks for doing this," he said after taking a sip. "I know. It would have been easier to just keep your distance." I studied the deep red of my wine. Easier, maybe. But not necessarily better. Not in the long run. He nodded, understanding. "For what it's worth, I think tonight might surprise you." Before I could ask what he meant, I saw Elaine approaching our table. She looked different. Somehow, less polished than usual, more human. Her hair was simply styled, her makeup minimal. She wore a navy wrap dress I didn't recognize, notably absent of the statement jewelry she typically favored. "Olivia," she said as she reached the table. Not "sweetheart" or "honey," just my name, straight and unembellished. "Thank you for coming." I stood, accepting her brief, slightly awkward hug. "Hello, Mom." She settled into the chair between Mason and me, completing our triangle. The waiter appeared almost immediately with a glass of white wine, suggesting she was a regular here. "How are you?" she asked, her voice carrying a caution I wasn't accustomed to hearing from her. "I'm well," I replied simply. "Busy with work?" She nodded, a small frown crossing her face. "Yes, I imagine you are. Mason told me he visited your office today." "He did," I confirmed, glancing at my brother. "He got the full tour. He said it was impressive," she continued. "The company you've built." I took a sip of wine, watching her over the rim of my glass. This was new territory, Elaine acknowledging my professional success without qualification or redirection. "It is," I said simply. No false modesty. No downplaying. Just fact. An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. In the past, Elaine would have filled it with chatter about mutual acquaintances or Mason's latest achievements. Tonight, she seemed unsure how to proceed. Mason cleared his throat. "Maybe we should order first, then talk?" We all nodded, grateful for the structural reprieve of studying menus and making selections. Once the waiter had taken our orders and disappeared, the buffer was gone. We were left with only ourselves and the conversation we needed to have. Elaine set her wine glass down with deliberate care. "Olivia," she began, her voice steadier than I'd expected. "I owe you an apology." I blinked, genuinely surprised. In 32 years, I could count on one hand the number of times I'd heard Elaine apologize for anything. "After you left on Thanksgiving," she continued, "Richard said some things that made me uncomfortable. About the way I've treated you compared to Mason. About opportunities and support I've given him that I never extended to you." She glanced at Mason, who nodded slightly, encouraging her to continue. My first instinct was to defend myself, she admitted. To explain all the reasons why my actions were justified or misunderstood. But then Carol, you know how direct she can be, said something I haven't been able to shake. I waited, curious despite myself. She asked me a simple question: when was the last time you were proud of Olivia for being Olivia, not for being more like Mason? Elaine's voice caught slightly. And I couldn't answer. The admission hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. It made me think about all the times I've tried to reshape your choices, your path, your very personality to match some template I thought was better. Some version of success I understood. She took a shaky breath. And then I thought about what you said, that I never asked about your life, your work, your dreams. Not really. And you were right. I sat very still, processing what I was hearing. This wasn't the quick, surface-level smoothing over I'd expected. This seemed like genuine reflection. So I'm asking now, she said, meeting my eyes directly. Tell me about Artisan Global. Tell me what you've built. The request caught me off guard. For years, I'd wanted Elaine to show real interest in my work. Now that she was asking, I found myself hesitant, protective of the world I'd created without her approval or input. Why now? I asked quietly. She considered the question. Because I realized I've been so focused on what I thought your life should be that I missed who you actually are. And I don't want to miss any more. Her words were simple but resonated with a sincerity I wasn't accustomed to hearing from her. I glanced at Mason, who was watching our exchange with careful attention but making no move to intervene or speak for either of us, another departure from our usual family dynamic. Artisan Global connects Indigenous artisans and craftspeople directly with global markets, I began cautiously. We eliminate exploitative middlemen and ensure creators receive fair compensation for their work. Elaine nodded, listening with an intensity I'd seen her direct at Mason countless times but rarely at me. We started in Colombia, working with 3 communities of weavers who were being paid pennies for work that was selling for hundreds in tourist shops. Now we partner with over 200 artisan groups across 37 countries. And you came up with this concept entirely on your own, she asked. After that trip to South America, I confirmed. The one you called, your quarter-life crisis, she finished, wincing slightly. I remember. It wasn't a crisis, I said evenly. It was research, though I didn't know it at the time. I saw a problem, talented craftspeople being exploited, and realized technology could provide a solution. Our appetizers arrived, creating a natural pause in the conversation. As we began eating, Elaine seemed to be gathering her thoughts. I never understood why you turned down Richard's offer, she said finally. The position at his firm. It seemed like such a solid opportunity. It was, I acknowledged. For someone who wanted that path. But I had a different vision. But it was so risky, she pressed, though her tone held more curiosity than criticism now. Starting your own company from scratch, with no safety net. I set down my fork. That's the thing, Mom. You've always equated safety with following a conventional path. Working for an established company, taking the secure route. But there's no real safety in surrendering your vision to someone else's. She frowned slightly. I never thought of it that way. I know, I said. You thought you were protecting me by pushing me toward what seemed secure. But what you were actually doing was telling me that my ideas, my instincts, my vision wasn't worth the risk. Mason shifted uncomfortably in his seat. While we're being honest, he interjected, I think we should acknowledge the financial disparity in how we were supported. Elaine's expression tightened. Mason, I don't think it's important, Mom, he said firmly. When my first company was failing, you stepped in. Covered nearly $500,000 in debt. Gave me the chance to start over without the weight of that failure following me. I kept my expression neutral, though the specific number was new information. I'd suspected significant financial support but hadn't known the extent. That was different, Elaine said defensively. You had investors, commitments. Your reputation was at stake. So was Olivia's when she was starting out, Mason countered. But you never offered her the same safety net. Elaine turned to me, genuine confusion in her expression. You never asked for help. Would you have given it if I had? I asked quietly. The same level of support, the same belief in my vision? Or would you have tried to redirect me toward something safer? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The silence was answer enough. I didn't ask, I continued, because I already knew what the response would be. You believed in Mason's potential inherently. Mine always came with conditions. Our entrees arrived, providing another momentary reprieve from the intensity of the conversation. As we began eating, I noticed Elaine was mostly moving food around her plate, her appetite apparently diminished by our discussion. I never intended to play favorites, she said finally, her voice small. Few parents do, I replied. But intention doesn't change impact. She nodded slowly. You're right. She looked up, meeting my gaze directly. I'm truly sorry, Olivia. For not seeing you clearly. For not supporting your vision with the same enthusiasm I gave Mason's. For making you feel like you had to succeed completely on your own to prove your worth. The apology hung in the air between us, unexpectedly direct, unexpectedly complete. I took a sip of wine, giving myself a moment to process. Thank you, I said finally. That means a lot. Is it enough? She asked, a vulnerability in her tone I'd rarely heard. I considered the question carefully. It's a start, I said honestly. A good one. But rebuilding trust takes time. She nodded, accepting this. I'd like to know more about your company. Not just the business model, but what it means to you. Why it matters. The request was so simple, so fundamental, and yet she'd never made it before. I found myself telling her about the women in Guatemala whose children were now attending school because of their increased income. About the master carver in Kenya who was training a new generation in traditional techniques that might otherwise have been lost. About the indigenous weaving cooperative in Peru that had purchased communal land to ensure their cultural practices could continue. As I spoke, I watched Elaine's expression transform from polite interest to genuine engagement. She asked thoughtful questions, not about profit margins or scalability, but about impact, about the lives being changed. This is remarkable work, she said when I finished. Truly meaningful. It is, I agreed. And it's exactly what I was meant to do, even though it didn't fit the template you had in mind for me. She nodded slowly. I see that now. I wish I had seen it sooner. The admission settled between us, not healing all wounds but acknowledging them, a necessary first step. Mason, who had been unusually quiet throughout this exchange, leaned forward. I have a proposal, he said. Something I've been thinking about since visiting Olivia's office today. We both turned to him, curious. Olivia, your platform connects artisans with markets willing to pay fair prices for their work. It's brilliant, and it's working. But what if we could expand it? I raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. My investment group has connections with major retailers looking to diversify their supply chains, to demonstrate ethical sourcing. What if we created a partnership? Your artisan network, our distribution channels. We could scale your impact exponentially. The proposal was unexpected but intriguing. You're serious about this? He nodded. Completely. It's good business, but it's also more than that. It's about using my position, my connections to amplify something that matters. I studied him, looking for signs of the old competitive dynamic, the need to insert himself into my success. Found none. This seemed genuine, an offer of collaboration between equals. I'd need to think about it, I said cautiously. Our artisans trust us because we've promised them protection from exactly the kind of corporate structures that have exploited them in the past. Any partnership would need to maintain those ethical guarantees. Absolutely, he agreed. I wouldn't suggest anything that compromised your core mission. But think of the impact we could have together. Elaine watched this exchange with an expression I couldn't quite read, not the proud beam she typically directed at Mason's business ventures, not the polite distance she usually maintained toward mine. Something new, something thoughtful. You two would make powerful partners, she said finally. Different strengths, different perspectives, but aligned values where it matters. The observation was surprisingly insightful, free of the comparative framework she'd always imposed on us. Maybe, I acknowledged. It's worth discussing further. As we finished our meal and moved to coffee and dessert, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, family news, mutual acquaintances, plans for the holidays. But something fundamental had changed in how we related to each other. Elaine listened more than she spoke. Mason made space for my perspectives rather than dominating the discussion. I felt less guarded, more willing to engage. It wasn't perfect. Years of established patterns couldn't be undone in a single dinner. But it was a beginning, a glimpse of what might be possible if we all continued the work of seeing each other more clearly. As the evening drew to a close, Elaine reached across the table and took my hand. I'd like to see it, she said. Your office, your team. I'd like to understand the world you've built. The request was simple but profound, an acknowledgement that my world had value, deserved to be seen and understood on its own terms. I'd like that, I replied, surprising myself with how much I meant it. As we gathered our things and prepared to leave, Mason pulled me aside. Thank you, he said quietly, for giving us this chance. I studied my brother, this person I'd grown up alongside but in many ways had never really known. It's strange. I observed. For years, I thought I needed to compete with you for a place in this family. Now I'm realizing maybe we both just needed the freedom to define success on our own terms. He nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. I've been thinking about something Uncle Richard said after you left on Thanksgiving. He said, the tragedy isn't that Olivia succeeded without your support. It's that you'll never know how much more she might have achieved with it. The words hit me unexpectedly hard, not because they were painful, but because they acknowledged a truth I'd never fully articulated even to myself, that while I'd succeeded despite the lack of family support, there had been a cost to that journey. Moments of doubt I'd faced alone. Obstacles that might have been easier to overcome with the same safety net extended so readily to Mason. That's perceptive of him, I said finally. He also said we still have time to get it right. Mason added. That families can heal if everyone's willing to do the work. I glanced over at Elaine, who was settling the bill despite my offer to pay. Do you think she's capable of real change? I asked quietly. Or is this just a reaction to being confronted? Mason considered the question seriously. I think. She's never had to question the story she's told herself about being a good mother, about treating us equally. Having that narrative challenged was genuinely shocking to her. That doesn't answer my question, I pointed out. I know, he acknowledged. The truth is, I don't know if she can change fundamentally. But I do think she wants to try. And that's something, isn't it? I nodded slowly. It's something. As we walked out of the restaurant into the cool evening air, Elaine approached me while Mason went to retrieve his car. Thank you for tonight, she said. For being willing to have this conversation. Thank you for listening, I replied. Really listening. She nodded, a certain sadness in her eyes. I've missed so much of your life, Olivia. Your successes, your struggles. I don't want to miss any more. Then don't, I said simply. Be present. Be interested. Not in who you think I should be, but in who I actually am. I'll try, she promised. I can't change the past, but going forward, I want to do better. As I drove home that night, I felt a curious mixture of emotions, caution, hope, a tentative openness to possibilities I'd long ago dismissed. One dinner couldn't erase years of patterns, couldn't heal all the small wounds of being overlooked, compared, found wanting. But it was a beginning. A chance to rewrite our family's story with a new awareness, a new respect for each person's individual journey. The old narrative, Mason as the golden child, me as the perpetual disappointment, had finally been challenged. What would replace it remained to be seen. But for the first time in years, I was genuinely curious to find out. When I reached my apartment, I found myself drawn to the small wooden box on my bookshelf, the last gift my grandmother Elizabeth had given me before she passed. Inside was a simple silver pendant engraved with her favorite saying, "Your path is your own. Walk it with courage." I'd followed that advice, building a life and a company I was proud of, regardless of whether my family understood or approved. That wouldn't change. But perhaps now, there was room for something new, not a return to old patterns, but the creation of healthier ones. Not seeking validation, but accepting recognition freely given. Not competing for a place, but knowing my worth regardless. Tomorrow, I would return to my office, to the company I'd built, to the work that fulfilled me. But I would do so with a slightly lighter heart, a little less burdened by the weight of unmet expectations and unacknowledged wounds. The future remained unwritten. But tonight had shown me it might contain possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to imagine, a family transformed by truth, relationships reshaped by genuine seeing and being seen. It wasn't guaranteed. It would require continued effort from all of us. But for the first time in years, it felt possible. And sometimes, possibility is enough to begin. 3 weeks after our dinner at Marcello's, I stood in the conference room of Artisan Global, preparing for a presentation I never imagined giving. The room was arranged perfectly, chairs in neat rows, presentation materials organized, samples of our artisans' work displayed elegantly along the perimeter. In 15 minutes, my mother would walk through that door to see my company for the first time. Not just my mother, Elaine would be accompanied by Mason, Uncle Richard, and Aunt Carol. A family contingent coming to understand the world I'd built without them. The thought sent a complex wave of emotions through me, pride, nervousness, a lingering caution about letting them into the space that had been entirely mine. Jada appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand. Everything's ready, she confirmed. The video connections to our partners in Colombia and Kenya are stable. They're excited to meet your family. I nodded, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from my blazer. Thank you. And the quarterly reports? Printed in the folders, she assured me. Though I still think that's more detail than necessary for a family visit. I smiled slightly. I know. But I want them to see the complete picture. No simplifying, no glossing over the challenges or the successes. Jada studied me for a moment, her expression thoughtful. This means a lot to you, doesn't it? Them seeing all this? It shouldn't, I admitted. After all this time, after building all this without their support or understanding, it shouldn't matter whether they see it now. But it does, she observed gently. But it does, I echoed. Not because I need their validation anymore, but because they're still your family, she finished for me. And somewhere deep down, you want them to be proud of the real you, not some version they imagined. I nodded, grateful for her insight. Jada had been with me since the beginning, she understood the significance of today perhaps better than anyone. They're here, she said, glancing at her phone. Reception just called up. I took a deep breath. Show them in. A few minutes later, the conference room door opened, and there they were, Elaine, looking slightly nervous in a conservative blue dress, Mason in his usual business attire, Uncle Richard, beaming with barely contained pride, and Aunt Carol, sharp-eyed and observant as always. Welcome to Artisan Global, I said, stepping forward to greet them. Olivia, Elaine breathed, taking in the space with wide eyes. This is impressive. I smiled, recognizing the genuine admiration in her tone. Thank you. Let me introduce you to Jada, my right hand and operations director. She's been with me since we were working out of my apartment. Jada stepped forward, shaking hands with each family member. It's wonderful to finally meet you all. Olivia has told me so much about you. A slight awkwardness passed through the group. We all knew those stories hadn't always been positive. But today wasn't about old wounds, it was about creating something new. Shall we begin the tour? I suggested, gesturing toward the door. As I led them through the office, I watched their reactions carefully. Uncle Richard asked insightful questions about our operational model. Aunt Carol paid particular attention to the artisan stories displayed on our walls. Mason noted the efficient layout and modern technology. And Elaine simply watched me, her expression a mixture of wonder and what looked almost like regret. When we reached the main workspace, I introduced them to my team, developers, marketing specialists, logistics coordinators, cultural liaisons. People who had believed in my vision when my own family hadn't seen it clearly. You've assembled quite a group, Mason observed as we continued walking. Diverse backgrounds, complementary skills. That was intentional, I replied. I wanted perspectives that would challenge mine, experiences different from my own. That diversity has been our strength. He nodded thoughtfully. I can see that. It's not how I would have built it, but I can see why it works. Coming from Mason, this was significant, acknowledging the validity of an approach different from his own. When we returned to the conference room, samples of our artisans' work were displayed, intricately woven textiles, hand-carved sculptures, beaded jewelry, each piece accompanied by the creator's story and a breakdown of how our platform had impacted their income. These are exquisite, Elaine said, running her fingers gently over a woven basket from Rwanda. Museum quality. That's exactly the point, I explained. These artisans are creating work of incredible value, but traditional markets have undervalued them for generations. We're changing that narrative. She nodded slowly. And these numbers, this shows the difference in what they earned before versus now? Yes, I confirmed. On average, our artisans have seen a 62% increase in income. But it's not just about money. It's about dignity, recognition, sustainability of cultural traditions. It's transformative, Uncle Richard said, examining the displays. Not just for them but for the market itself. You're creating a new paradigm. I smiled at him, grateful for his understanding. That was always the goal. Not just a business, but a model for how commerce could be more equitable. I have to admit, Aunt Carol said, settling into one of the chairs, when you first mentioned this idea years ago, I thought it sounded idealistic. Admirable, but perhaps not practical. I was wrong. Her candor was refreshing. Many people thought that, I acknowledged. Including potential investors who couldn't see beyond the traditional model. Which is why you self-funded, Mason interjected. Retained complete control. I nodded. It was harder in some ways, slower growth initially. But it meant we never had to compromise our core values for quarterly profits. We all took seats around the conference table. The moment felt ceremonial somehow, my family sitting in my space, engaged with my vision, seeing me clearly perhaps for the first time. I've prepared a presentation about our growth and future plans, I began, opening my laptop. But first, I thought you might like to meet some of our partners directly. With a few keystrokes, the large screen on the wall came to life, revealing the smiling faces of Maria from Colombia and Jabari from Kenya, leaders of two of our earliest artisan cooperatives. Good morning from Nairobi, Jabari said warmly. And good afternoon from Maria in Bogota. Olivia has told us about her family, Maria added. We are happy to finally meet you. What followed was a 30-minute conversation that moved me. More than I'd anticipated. Maria explained how our partnership had allowed the women in her cooperative to send their daughters to school, breaking a cycle of limited opportunity. Jabari showed the new workshop they had built, where traditional carving techniques were being taught to the next generation. Throughout their stories, I watched my family's reactions. Uncle Richard nodded appreciatively, clearly seeing the business genius in the model. Aunt Carol seemed genuinely moved by the human impact. Mason was taking notes, his expression thoughtful. But it was Elaine who surprised me most. She asked questions, real, engaged questions about the artisans' lives, their challenges, their hopes for the future. Not polite small talk, but genuine curiosity about these people whose lives had been changed through a platform her daughter had created. When the video call ended, she turned to me with tears in her eyes. Olivia, she said softly. What you've built here, it's extraordinary. The simple acknowledgement, free from comparison or qualification, filled a space inside me I hadn't realized was still empty. Thank you, I said simply. I want to see the numbers, Mason said, his tone not challenging but professionally curious. The full picture, growth trajectory, profit margins, operational costs. I slid folders across the table to each of them. It's all here. Nothing simplified, nothing hidden. The successes and the challenges. As they reviewed the materials, I gave a presentation on our 5-year plan, expansion into new regions, development of educational components, potential partnerships with ethical retailers. Throughout, they listened with an attention I'd never experienced from them before, focused, respectful, engaged. When I finished, Uncle Richard was the first to speak. You've created something remarkable here, Olivia. Not just a successful business, but a model that could transform how global commerce functions. I agree, Mason said, looking up from the financial reports. These numbers are impressive by any standard. Sustainable growth, healthy margins, minimal debt. And the impact metrics, those are the real story. I watched him carefully, looking for signs of the competitive comparison that had defined our relationship for so long. Found none. This was professional respect, one entrepreneur to another. What I don't understand, Elaine said finally, is why you never told us about any of this. Even after it was clearly succeeding. The question hung in the air, not accusatory but genuinely bewildered. I considered my answer carefully. I tried, in the beginning, I said. The first year, I mentioned the concept at family dinners, tried to explain the vision. But the responses were dismissive. A nice little project. A phase. Something to keep me busy until I found a real career. Elaine winced, recognizing her own phrases quoted back to her. After a while, I continued, it became easier. To just stop sharing. To build this world separately from the family, where it didn't have to constantly justify its existence. I remember those conversations differently, Elaine said quietly. I thought I was being supportive, just concerned about your financial security. I know, I acknowledged. You weren't trying to hurt me. You truly believed you were protecting me from risk, from potential failure. But what I needed wasn't protection, it was belief. The kind you gave Mason automatically. She nodded slowly, acceptance rather than defense in her expression. You're right. And I'm deeply sorry for that. The apology, spoken in this space that represented everything I'd built without her support, carried a weight that previous ones hadn't. Moving forward, Mason said, redirecting the conversation with characteristic focus, I'd like to discuss the partnership idea I mentioned at dinner. I've done some preliminary research, identified several retailers who might be appropriate collaborators. I smiled slightly at his shift to business matters, so typical of Mason to process emotions through practical action. I've been thinking about it too, I admitted. There's potential there, as long as we maintain strict ethical standards. Absolutely, he agreed immediately. That's non-negotiable. The value of what you've built is in its integrity. Coming from Mason, who had previously operated in a much more traditional business framework, this understanding felt like a significant evolution. I'd like to be involved, Elaine said suddenly. We all turned to her, surprised. Not in running things, she clarified quickly. That's your domain, Olivia. But I have connections in the museum world, in cultural institutions. There could be exhibition opportunities, educational components that would amplify your artisan's work beyond the commercial market. The offer caught me off guard, not just the practical suggestion, which was actually quite insightful, but the way it positioned Elaine as a supporter rather than a director of my path. That's worth exploring, I said cautiously. Only if you want it, she added, seeming to understand my hesitation. This is your vision. I'm just offering resources, not trying to take over or redirect. The distinction was important, and new. For the first time, Elaine was offering support on my terms, not hers. Thank you, I said, meaning it. Let's discuss that further. As the formal presentation concluded and we moved to a more casual lunch in the office kitchen, I found myself observing the subtle shifts in our family dynamic. Mason engaged with my team as colleagues, not as his sister's employees. Uncle Richard spoke about my business model with the same respect he'd always accorded Mason's ventures. Aunt Carol drew out stories from my staff about our impact work with genuine interest. And Elaine watched me in my element with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the anxious concern of the past, not the polite distance she'd maintained toward my projects, but something like wonder. Like she was seeing me clearly for the first time and finding herself amazed by the person who had been there all along. Over lunch, the conversation flowed more easily than any family gathering I could remember. We talked about business, yes, but also about other things, books, travel, world events, with a new equality in whose opinions were solicited, whose experiences were centered. As the visit drew to a close, Elaine lingered while the others gathered their things. Could we have a moment? She asked quietly. I nodded, leading her back to my private office, a space I designed carefully with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, walls adorned with art from our partner communities. This suits you, she observed, taking in the room. Strong, but warm, purposeful. Thank you, I replied, genuinely touched by her perception. She turned to face me fully. I've been doing a lot of thinking since Thanksgiving. About the stories I told myself about who you were, who you should be. About the ways I limited you without even realizing it. I sat down, indicating the chair across from me. This conversation felt too important for standing. When you were growing up, she continued, settling into the seat, I thought I was guiding you toward security, toward a path that would protect you from disappointment. I didn't realize I was actually trying to make you smaller, safer, more controllable. The admission was startlingly honest. With Mason, I encouraged risk, celebrated ambition. With you, I counseled caution, compromise. I told myself it was because you were different, needed different things. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of what? I asked gently. She considered the question. Afraid that if I encouraged you to follow your own path completely, you might go somewhere I couldn't follow. Somewhere beyond my understanding or influence. The insight was surprisingly perceptive. And that's exactly what happened, I observed. She nodded, a sad smile touching her lips. Yes. Despite my efforts to prevent it. Or perhaps because of them. You had to go further away to find the space to become fully yourself. The understanding in her words touched something deep inside me, a recognition that had been missing from our relationship for as long as I could remember. I want you to know, she continued, that I am immensely proud of what you've built here. Not because it's successful by conventional metrics, though it certainly is, but because it's so completely, authentically you. Thoughtful, innovative, compassionate, principled. Tears pricked at my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. I'd told myself for years that I no longer needed her approval, her recognition. Yet hearing it now, in this space that represented everything I'd achieved, moved me more than I would have predicted. That means a lot, I said simply, not trusting myself with more words. I have a gift for you, she said, reaching into her purse. Something I should have given you long ago. She placed a small velvet box on the desk between us. I opened it cautiously to find a vintage silver locket, one I recognized immediately from old family photographs. Grandmother Elizabeth's, I breathed. Elaine nodded. It was meant to be yours at your college graduation. But I held on to it. Told myself you weren't ready, that you needed to be more settled, more established. More like Mason, I said quietly. Yes, she admitted. More like what I understood. But she left specific instructions that it should go to you. She said you were the one who would understand its meaning. I opened the locket carefully. Inside was a tiny scrap of paper with handwritten words. To chart one's own course requires the bravest heart. Fresh tears threatened. Grandmother Elizabeth had always seen me clearly, had recognized something in me that my mother couldn't, or wouldn't, acknowledge. She was right about you, Elaine said softly. And I was wrong. I'm so sorry it took me this long to see it. I closed my fingers around the locket, feeling its weight, not just the physical object but the recognition it represented, the lineage of independent thought it connected me to. Thank you, I said, the words inadequate for the complex emotions flowing through me. I know this doesn't erase the past, she acknowledged. The years of feeling unseen, unsupported. But I hope it might be a beginning. A new chapter where I can be the mother you actually need, not the one trying to make you into someone else. The offer hung between us, tentative, hopeful, imperfect but sincere. "I'd like that," I said finally. "Not to pretend the past didn't happen, but to build something new going forward. Something healthier." She nodded, relief visible in her expression. "That's all I ask. A chance." As we rejoined the others, I felt a subtle but significant shift within myself. The anger, the need for validation, the protective walls I'd built around my achievements, they weren't gone entirely, but they had softened, transformed into something more nuanced. "Ready to go?" Mason asked as we approached. "Actually," I said, making a spontaneous decision, "I thought we might continue this conversation over dinner. If everyone's free, there's a great restaurant nearby." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic agreement. As we gathered our things and prepared to leave, Jada caught my eye across the room, raising an eyebrow in silent question. I gave her a small nod. Yes, this was okay. Yes, I was letting them in, cautiously, intentionally, on my terms. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city streets. As we walked toward the restaurant, I found myself between Elaine and Mason, a physical positioning that seemed symbolic of our evolving dynamic. Not the overlooked daughter trailing behind, not the perpetual disappointment kept at a distance, but an equal participant in this family narrative. "You know," Mason said thoughtfully, "we should consider making these meetings regular. Monthly business discussions, sharing insights across our companies. There's a lot we could learn from each other." "I'd like that," I agreed, recognizing the offer for what it was, an acknowledgement of equal standing, professional respect. "And perhaps some non-business gatherings too," Elaine suggested tentatively. "Family dinners where work stays off the table entirely." I glanced at her, appreciating the clear boundaries she was proposing. "That sounds good too." As we continued walking, I felt the weight of the silver locket against my skin, a tangible reminder of the journey that had brought me here. Not just the professional success, but the personal evolution, from seeking external validation to finding my own measure of worth, from fitting into others' expectations to creating a life authentically my own. The path hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, of loneliness, of wondering whether the distance from my family was too high a price for staying true to my vision. But standing here now, respected on my own terms, seeing clearly at last, I knew the journey had been necessary. Not just for the company I'd built, but for the person I'd become. Ahead of us, the restaurant's warm lights beckoned. Behind us, the Artisan Global offices stood as testament to a vision realized despite every obstacle. And within me, a quiet certainty had taken root, that worthiness isn't granted by others' approval, that true success lies not in meeting external expectations but in having the courage to define them for yourself. "You know," Uncle Richard said, falling into step beside me, "Elizabeth always said you were the one who would surprise us all. Watch Olivia," she used to tell me. "She'll forge her own path, and it will be magnificent." I smiled, touched by the memory. "I wish she could have seen all this." "Oh, I think she knew," he replied. "She recognized that spark in you. The one that wouldn't be diminished, no matter how much others might try to contain it." As we reached the restaurant, I paused for a moment, looking back at the path we'd traveled, literally today, metaphorically over years. The journey wasn't complete, relationships shaped by decades of patterns wouldn't transform overnight. There would be setbacks, old habits reasserting themselves, moments of frustration on all sides. But something fundamental had shifted. A truth had been spoken and acknowledged. A new possibility had emerged, not of erasing the past, but of creating a future with clearer seeing, greater respect, more authentic connection. I touched the locket once more, feeling its subtle weight against my skin. To chart one's own course requires the bravest heart. My grandmother had understood what had taken me years to fully grasp, that the courage to follow your own vision, despite doubt or dismissal from even those closest to you, is perhaps life's most important act of self-trust. As I joined my family at the restaurant table, I carried that understanding with me. Not as a wall to keep them at a distance, but as a foundation upon which something new might be built, relationships based not on who anyone thought I should be, but on who I had proven myself to be. Relationships that could grow and evolve precisely because they were rooted in truth rather than expectation. And in that moment, surrounded by family who were seeing me clearly perhaps for the first time, I felt a quiet certainty: this was just the beginning of new possibilities, new connections, new understanding. The story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning to be written. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.